for subscribers to davidlake.com. And this week, the whole thing is going to be a chat with Richie Allen up in Manchester. Morning, Rich.
Morning, Icke.
And we're going to go through the news of the week. And, of course, Richie, there's been an extraordinary explosion of wind coming out of the UN this week, which is probably a good place to start.
Everybody was expecting you to talk about the weather in the Caribbean there, which I know you're going to come to. That's right, the UN General Assembly this week. That's my dog barking in the background, by the way. We laughed about this last week. It might happen. There's nobody here looking after her. The UN General Assembly met this week. The leaders of the world, the free world, were there, the so-called leaders of the free world. You want to take issue with things said by Theresa May and Donald Trump with regards to proxy terrorism. This is really important.
Yeah, I mean, I've been saying for years and years and years that this world is an inversion. It's on its head. It's on its arse. It's upside down. And there can be few greater expressions of this than the speeches this week of the British Prime Minister Theresa May and the US President, both of which are very difficult to say, but of course I have to because it's unfortunately true. Yeah. Donald Trump, the guy in the White House. If we start with Theresa May, she made this speech at the UN, and she says, "And just as it is the responsibility of nations not to seek to advance their interests through terrorist or proxy groups," pauses, breathes deeply. This is the Prime Minister of Britain saying this. "So it is also our responsibility of each of us to act together in the face of the most egregious violations of our common rules and standards. Clearly, responsibility for the chaos and tragedy that we see in Syria lies firmly at the door of Assad." This was spoken without laughing by a woman who has been a member of governments that have, with the United States, funded proxy armies called rebels and freedom fighters in places like Libya and Syria and others, to devastate, destroy, and mass murder vast numbers of people in the name not of fighting dictators, but in advancing an agenda that was written down and published in September 2000 by the neocon faction that came into power with the Bush administration and kicked off this whole sequence of chaos. And she uses the word there, chaos. What I've been saying all these years is the currency of control is chaos, because it's a technique that you might call creative destruction. You have a status quo, and you need to destroy the status quo to put another one in place. So you have to create chaos for the status quo and chaos and destruction. That brings it down. Now you have a new status quo. Now you destroy that one with chaos, and you get another status quo. And each new status quo brought about by chaos and destruction and violence takes you further and further along the road that you wish to go. And so we had these countries named by this organization, this neoconservative far-right organization called the Project for the American Century. And the countries it named, Syria, Libya, Iran, North Korea, and so on, Iraq, are all the countries that have either been targeted, are in the process of being targeted, or are being demonized now. It's just a list that they're going through. And they're doing it because if you invade Iraq, and then you invade someone else, then you invade someone else with actually troops with your uniforms on, then people are going to ask questions. They're going to say, what's going on? We're invading everybody. So you do it by training, arming, and funding so-called rebels to attack your target, quote, regime, and do it for you. And for Theresa May to talk about terrorists and proxy groups being used by other countries, when that is absolutely what the United States, the United Kingdom, and NATO have been doing all along, is extraordinary. Now, of course, there's a human disease called cognitive dissonance, where you believe two totally opposing things at the same time and believe both are true. Clearly, that exists at the level of Theresa May. And even Donald Trump, man-child as he is, you cannot explain this away as cognitive dissonance. They know they're frickin' lying. They know what they're saying is outrageous nonsense and stunning mendacity. And these are the people that come into power. Power in theory, the real power is in the shadows. But those in the shadows want people like this and develop people like this who will stand up and lie while knowing they're lying. And there are even not educational, but there are programs that teach these people to do it. I remember Tony Blair was described brilliantly on one occasion when someone said of his lies when he delivered them, he believes them when he says them.
Yeah.
And they have this ability, this barefaced, stunning ability to spew out their lies and their inversion of the truth. In a way that, as they deliver it, they actually probably believe it at the moment of delivery, as that person said about Tony Blair. And this Theresa May UN speech was a classic of its kind, where she's talking about the fundamental values we share. See, it's another perception manipulation technique that you paint yourself constantly as the opposite of what you are. So you have a whole history, Britain has a whole history, America has a whole history of death, destruction, and demolition of human rights, fairness, and justice. So to avoid that, you have to keep repeating over and over again that actually that's what you stand for, all the things that you're destroying. Even when I was a kid, Rich, I remember wondering why America had to be told again and again that it was the freest country in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, these things should be obvious. They shouldn't need constantly repeating. Because when I first went to the United States in the early 1990s and spent a lot of time there, I was stunned as an outsider to see how unfree it was. You know, even in those days, in Britain, you still had, the odd park keeper, the little bloke in the hut,
yeah. Parky,
looking after a park. But the park police in America had guns. You know what I mean?
They could kill you. Yeah.
If only you could see it as an outsider sees it. So when you are not free, you have to keep telling people they are. May went on that nations have to act together in our shared interest and form a multilateral system. This is centralization of global power. If you put it through the Orwellian translation unit. And she said, and it is this rules-based system which we have developed, including the institutions, the international frameworks of free and fair trade, agreements such as the Paris Climate Accord, and laws and conventions like the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, of course, does not apply to Israel, because no one asks them if they have nuclear weapons, even though everyone knows they have. So they're not part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But of course, that's never mentioned, because Israel gets whatever it wants. And she says all this enables the global cooperation through which we protect our values. And she is talking about protecting the values of constant death, destruction, and centralization of power in the world. They're the values in this inversion that she's talking about. She went on to talk about the terrorists did not win with all the attacks that Britain has had recently, but of course they did win.
Yes,
and they do win because of people like Theresa May, who immediately reacts to anything with troops on the streets and demands for more and more surveillance, more and more control, and more censorship of the internet, where she's talking about we must censor hate, etc. on the internet. But of course, the definition of that will encompass the real target, which are those that are putting out information challenging the official version of everything. She said, we will never let anyone destroy our way of life. She is doing it. Trump is doing it. And the interesting thing, or many interesting things between the Trump speech and the May speech, is although, it's kind of trumpeted, she had a go at him over the Paris Climate Accord, in a week where a new study came out saying actually the whole thing's been overblown, even from an official science point of view. But never mind the facts, just keep going, because the climate hoax is all part of justifying this incessant centralization of power in the world. But apart from that, the common themes between them were there to be seen. With Trump too, talking about the fact that the United States does not want to impose its will on the rest of the world, that it respects the sovereignty of every country and the people's will of every country. And despite its overwhelming military power, America never tries to impose its will on any country. I mean, like I say, you can't write that away with cognitive dissonance. That is blatant. I know I'm lying,
but I'm doing it anyway.
And another common theme, Rich, between the two was this: we must reform the United Nations. She's saying that she will withhold money funding until the organization demonstrates better value for money. And she says the UN and its agencies must win our trust by proving to us and the people we represent that they can deliver. Now, that is taken as we represent the people of the country we are official leader of, but actually the people we represent really refers to those in the shadows who these leaders really represent. And all this stuff about from Trump and May this week about the need for UN reform is related to what I was writing about in the mid-1990s, the plan to move and morph the UN into a fully fledged world government, a centralized dictatorship dictating to every community and every country. So that's what we're seeing now. This word reform is a classic buzzword for this hidden hand. Remember how Tony Blair was always talking about reform, reform, reform. What that is a code word for is changing the status quo to take us further down the road to this agenda for the centralization of global power. And so we need to watch this very carefully from now on, because you're going to see more and more talk about the need to reform the United Nations. And you're going to hear them talking about the fact that the United Nations has to have more power. And another thing that Theresa May said in the speech, which was kind of not reported except in the full speech, she said that Britain was the second biggest funder of the UN.
That's right. She did say that.
What? Um, why is Britain? I mean, look at it on the map. See if you can find it. Why is Britain the second biggest funder of the UN? Why is Britain on the UN Security Council? Why isn't France on the UN Security Council? Why is this? How can it be? But once you understand that places like the United States and the United Kingdom, big time the United Kingdom, France, etc., are big centers where this hidden hand works through, and the means through which it enforces its will on the world, then you can see why, despite much bigger countries and etc., that France and the United Kingdom are both on the UN Security Council and the second biggest funder of the UN. Yeah. I mean, how can in any way that be worked out?
90 million quid a year the UK sends to the United Nations. That's right. The UK has threatened to withhold a third or just under a third of that unless the organisation reforms. And how can I argue with what you just said? It's absolutely bang on. It's not about reforming it. It's about, you know, handing it more and more over to those pulling the strings in the shadows. You called it a puppet show in a brilliant meme that you've produced over the last 24 hours. That's exactly what it is. It's funny you mentioned France. We know people, of course, who travel to and from France regularly for work. And Paris, David, is some sort of dystopian future. We used to see these futuristic films, didn't we, where cities would be portrayed as really dystopian and Orwellian. France is basically still under a state of emergency, and wherever you go in Paris, excuse me, I should say Paris, not France, but wherever you go in Paris, you're confronted by Kevlar wearing, balaclava wearing, armed to the teeth police. And that's obviously connected to what you're talking about there, France being on the Security Council.
Yeah, and what they're doing, and because again, as I keep coming back to, it's all about manipulation of perception. And it's all about changing the status quo through creative destruction. So you eventually move from a point where troops on the streets are, whoa, there's troops on the streets.
Yeah.
To it becomes the new norm, becomes the new status quo. And people stop questioning it on the same scale, because one of the greatest forms of mind control and perception control is familiarity. Familiarity. Once you become familiar with something, you stop questioning it. Becomes a gimme. It becomes the way things are. And again, with Theresa May, who was a freedom-destroying Home Secretary in Britain before she became Prime Minister, who launches troops in the streets after each terrorist attack, and you have the situation recurring also that when there is a terrorist attack, suddenly the threat goes on to critical, or whatever the highest one term they use.
It is critical.
It's critical.
Right. Yeah.
Why wasn't it critical before the attack happened? Well, you know, why is it now critical because there's been an attack, and why 24 hours later is it downgraded to severe, or whatever the bloody word they use is? Why is it less imminent now than it was yesterday or the day before? It's a game. It's a game of perception and emotional manipulation, moving towards a particular end. And one of the major ends is becoming clearer and clearer, and that's using terrorism. It's been used in so many different ways to destroy freedom and change the very way of life that she says won't change. Keep telling them your way of life is not changing while you're changing it, then they might not notice that you're changing it.
Do you think, David, Parisians have become accustomed to seeing the unbelievable military presence there? Do you think that they've already just gotten used to it? It's become a matter of fact.
Well, some will have done. Yeah. I mean, obviously there'll be some that won't have fallen for it and will be going, what the hell's going on? When is this going to end? But this is why they chose a war on terror. Because when do you know a war on terror is over? You know, when you have a war between two countries, eventually someone gets defeated, and you say the war is over, or they agree an armistice or something. You say the war is over. With a war on terror, you can never say when the war is over, because when's the next terrorist attack? You don't know. So because the war can never be said to be over, you can leave in place all the things that you want to be there in a police military state, like troops on the street, and justify it by, well, we don't know when the next attack is. It becomes an ongoing thing. If the war on terrorism had an official end, then you couldn't justify troops on the streets anymore. But that's not the way it works in this perception manipulation that is bombarding the human psyche now. But the longer the troops are there, the more it becomes the norm. And all this technology that's taking our freedoms away becomes the norm. And as generations replace generations, it's not even questioned, because the new generation, to that new generation, what is abhorrent to other generations that had a compass, a point of perspective by living in a world that wasn't like that once. People like me are born in the 1950s. To new generations, they're born into the world as it is. It's their norm. They've known anything else.
It's there
and
when
this
they
is
arrive,
the transition, Rich, that's going on. Because the idea eventually is that we do have a global military police state with no freedom whatsoever, and no freedom of expression, none of it. And what we're seeing, as I was saying earlier, with the solutions being put forward to these terrorist attacks, is summed up by this headline from this week: "Take down hate videos in 2 hours or else," says May. "Web giants with blood on their hands." It's enough. Now these immoral web giants must face the full penalty of the law. And this is another mind game that's going on, Richie, with all this. First of all, you have a web. And there's a spider at the center of the web. Let's call it the hidden hand. Each strand in the web is a secret society, a semi-secret group, or an organization we see in the public arena.
Yeah.
Further you go out from the web, you eventually hit those strands in the web that we see: government agencies, governments, banks, corporations, etc., internet giants. So the spider is dictating through the web what the agenda is. This is how you get a situation where world leaders make speeches, and in key areas, they're all saying the same thing and pushing the same agenda. That's how it works. So you have people like Google and Facebook, increasingly Twitter and others, YouTube, owned by Google, of course. And they are assets of this web. And the whole idea was to be Mr. Nice Guy. Hey, T-shirt. I wear a great T-shirt. I'm one of you guys. Hey, cool, man. Until you get to the point of virtual monopoly. And once you get to that point, then you start dictating what people can see and what they can't see in terms of information. And that's what we're seeing now. So we have these internet giants, owned by and controlled by the same people ultimately, who are targeting in every way possible the alternative media to stop information challenging the official narrative from circulating. And they're doing it systematically. They're even admitting much of it now. But at the same time, they're going through this farce of opposing governments demanding that they take down this and they take down that, and because the governments are saying it's helping terrorists. And you're going through this dance in the public arena. You must do that. Take down hate videos in 2 hours or else. Oh no, we won't want to do that. But of course, what happens in the end is the governments pass legislation to stop that happening. And in doing so, they pull into that legislation, by the way it's worded, all the areas of the internet that aren't about hate or terrorism, but are about exposing what's really going on. And then the internet giants, they have a cover story. Well, we didn't want to do this, we want freedom and all that stuff. But I mean, what can we do? Yeah, okay. That's that. You care about freedom so much that without any pressure whatsoever, you're targeting the alternative media in every way you can. It's all a game. It's all a mind game, and people need to realize the scale of what's happening, the coordination of what's happening. And to see that there is a road we're going down quite demonstrably. And if you do any research at all, you can call these people out, not when what happens, but before it happens, because you know where they want to take us. And these speeches from Trump and May at the UN this week were classics of their kind, both in the inverted mendacity that they both betrayed, but also in what they were calling for, because what they were calling for was pushing us further down the road to the Orwellian nightmare.
That's absolutely brilliant. That's hugely important right now. Your description of Zuckerberg and those who run Twitter and Google. I suppose a lot of people will think that, they will still have the mindset that these are ordinary people who came up with these social media gigantic platforms, and that those people will resist the pressure from international governments and politicians to clamp down on what people are doing. But of course they won't, and we're seeing it every single day of the week. We can talk about it personally. I mean, we won't now because there's a lot more you want to get into. But our various YouTube channels where we upload interviews, where you upload videos and podcasts, the demonetization of that, we've seen it across the board. So depending on these guys to stand up to governments, as you just said there, it's not going to happen, because the backstories of the Zuckerbergs and these other people are very questionable anyway, David.
Joke.
Yeah.
You see, when your centralization of power on the scale that they want and the scale that's unfolding depends for its existence and its effectiveness on computerized advanced technology, are they really sitting round a table, these people, saying, well, what we're going to do? We don't have the technology. Oh, hold on a minute. Some geek in a garage in California has just discovered exactly what we want. Oh, what a bit of luck. I mean, it's a joke. These are cover stories. The T-shirt, and I watched a couple of BBC documentaries about Silicon Valley recently. And they did a sequence in one of them of garage doors, because behind these different garage doors they were plonking on the screen, major technological developments were discovered. They were all middle-class America garage doors. It's like, I buy that. Yeah, that I'm sure that happened. I mean, you can imagine them sitting around a table going, well, haven't we overdone the garage doors bit? Can't we come up with another cover story? It doesn't involve a garage. I mean, it's insane. This technology has been around. It's developed in underground bases. You look at the what do you call it? The office assistants. That people like Google and Apple and all these people develop. You have to have a piece of technology next to you now to be your office assistant. I mean, hello, how did we survive before? But that technology was seed funded by the CIA. Google, before it became Google, was seed funded by the CIA. These are not organizations that came organically out of behind a garage door. They were their cover stories to get this technology into the public arena without people realizing where it's really coming from. And therefore, this dance that I talk about between governments. You must censor. Oh, we mustn't. We don't want to censor. It's all a joke.
Theatre, pure theatre.
Create the means of censoring.
Right. This is the Dot Connector with David Icke for subscribers to davidicke.com. Do go to davidicke.com and subscribe.